Talk this morning. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for the way in which faithfully different people open it for us each week here in church. Help us to understand what you want to say to us through your word this morning. For Jesus' sake. Amen. We're in the middle of, we've begun a series on the Sermon on the Mount. It's quite a long sermon, so it'll go on for a few weeks. And the topic this week, Jesus on keeping our word. And this comes from 33 to 37. So let's, Matthew chapter 5, we'll read these words together. Jesus said, "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the oaths you have made.' But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot even make one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Everything beyond this comes from the evil one." I don't know whether you have taken an oath. I can remember when I was called to give evidence in court, and I was trying to be, as I always try to be, a very good Christian. And I knew that I would be given a Bible and asked to swear in the Bible what I said was true. And I thought of these verses, and I thought, should I be swearing on the Bible when Jesus says, "Do not swear an oath"? And I said to myself, I shall say, I am a Christian, and I will affirm that I will tell the truth. I will not swear on the Bible. When I got there, I was so terrified of the whole thing that I got the Bible and read what was on the card, and so I just carried on shaking for the whole time. And I got let off, so that was good. So, no, that's not true. It was somebody else's case. I thought I'd better straighten that out right now. The Sermon on the Mount, it's very interesting. When you can read, if you look it up and Google it, you'll find people telling you it's the greatest sermon taught. It's saying all sort of wonderful things about it. And of course that's true in one sense. But when you read it in detail, it's quite complicated. And one of the realities of the Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus taught it, and it has truth that is truth for all time, for all of us. But it was also dealing with a very specific situation. No one ever speaks. Well, they might write something to last forever, but in a sense, Jesus was talking to people, and he was going through this whole idea of what they understood the law of God to be, and trying to reveal to them what God really wanted them to do. And the reason he was doing that was partly because there had been a kind of accretion. You know how something really pure, when it gets sort of stuff added to it and it goes all crusty? Should have thought of these illustrations before I start on them. But there's a sense in which the Pharisees and the teachers of the law had taken the law, and they tried to make it clearer and easier for people, but they'd added all these layers around it. And it became something almost needed to be peeled off to find out what the truth was underneath. And that's partly what Jesus was dealing with here. So he says, again, you heard it said. Notice, he's not saying God said. He's not referring to the original law that was given. He's saying, you've heard it said. He's referring to the teaching that had been given around the law that had been given. Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the oaths you have made. There was a sense in which this statement was a summary of some of the laws that had been given in the Old Testament, in the Torah. And you can see some of them on the screen. Here, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. You shall not swear by my name falsely, Leviticus 19. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by some agreement, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. There was a sense in which they were focusing, they were trying to do quite a clever thing. They were trying to make, it seems, the law a bit easier. Isn't it interesting how you can have rules and people trying to find ways around them and make them easier? I can't think of an example at the moment, but you might be able to. Here they were 2,000 years ago. Here was the law given, and they were trying to make it both easy, but also easy to understand, but sometimes, in a way, easier to keep. And what they'd done was two things going on at the same time. The first thing they'd done was to say this is actually, and I had to read this a few times to make sense of it, They were actually saying, perhaps it's not about taking the name of the Lord in vain, but it's about taking the name of the Lord in vain. Does that make any sense to you? Well, I tried to sum it up by saying they tried to make it about profanity, about swearing, not about perjury. Because you take an oath in court, as I did, because there is an obligation, if you're in a legal proceeding, for the truth to be told. If people don't tell the truth in court, what chance has the person accused got? If they're innocent of being found innocent, people could tell all sorts of stories. That's what the whole process is about. And of course, the process in court is like that precisely because people are not convinced that when people stand up in court, they will necessarily tell the truth. Strange, isn't it? Our whole system has to be built around the possibility that people may tell lies. And of course, it's a serious thing to lie in court for exactly that reason. And it's quite interesting how many Christians often think about taking the name of the Lord in vain is more about swearing than it is about keeping your word. I'm not saying swearing is a good thing, but Jesus is not referring to being loose with your language. He's about whether we are people who keep our word. So they tried to make it about profanity and not perjury, and then they sort of took the perjury bit as well, and they started to do something quite clever. They started to make elaborate rules for taking oaths. Only the ones that mention God's name are really binding. So that's why Jesus makes these references in the... Oh, there it goes. About not swearing by heaven or earth or Jerusalem. You see, what they were doing was, well, if we don't swear in God's name, we swear by Jerusalem. That's like one step down. So it's slightly less serious if we break the oath. They were trying to create a kind of staircase of oath-taking. And the only really serious ones were the ones that mentioned the name of God. If you mention the name of God, then you had to take it really seriously. But if you mentioned heaven or earth, well, that you were being serious, but it wasn't quite as serious. It's a kind of casuistry. Actually, we all do it a little bit. We all know that when we really want to be serious and we say, well, I really mean this, we'll have extra things we add into it because sometimes you just have to emphasize you really mean it. So they had this kind of gradation of ways you could take oaths. Jesus says it's all daft. It said, because heaven, God made it. Earth, God made it. Jerusalem is the home of the king. So God's still involved. God hears the oath you make. It's no good trying to pretend that because you use this particular formula, you've got a kind of way out. This was only a level C oath, so I can break it quite easily. And that was the kind of thing that was going on. And what Jesus was trying to say, and what Jesus says very clearly, is something very obvious and very straightforward. All you need to say is simply yes or no. If people kept the law of God, if people lived in God's earth in God's way, then you and I would be able to talk to each other and we'd know that we were telling the truth. We wouldn't have to have that level of extra. And that's very interesting in our society at the moment. People who are followers of Jesus are people who, when they speak, their word should be accepted because people know and trust that they will tell the truth. And that's an easy thing to say and a harder thing to do. And what I want to do, I was trying to think about how to illustrate this and what the implications of it is. Telling lies and breaking promises, the first thing it does is it rots society. If you can't trust people, I used to hear people talk about business as it used to be done in the old days. You used to take a handshake and people knew that meant something. One of the advantages of being ancient and old like I am is that I join the people who watch Bargain Hunt at lunchtime. And there's always interesting, they always haggle, don't they? And the people always seem willing to have something that was marked at £160 suddenly becomes £80. You can't quite understand why. And then they shake hands on it. And they're doing a tradition that's gone on for a very, very long time. And it was an understanding, if you shook hands on it, that was your word. You'd given your word. That was the deal. You wouldn't be able to turn around in 2 weeks' time and say, oh, well, I did promise to give you 80 quid. Actually, I'm only going to give you 40 quid. And that was part of the way society worked, or was supposed to work. I'm sure it was slightly, rose-tinted spectacles looking back. Of course, there were lots of people who broke their word, but there was an understanding that was how it should be. And when I was thinking about the way in which telling lies and breaking promises, I tried to resist this, but I have been probably slightly obsessive over the past few months about a certain person. And I don't want to say too much, you'll have your own view. I have found it really, really upsetting. And actually one of the points that was made, something I was reading, is that one of the realities of our system is that it depends on people being good chaps. So that if somebody goes to Parliament and tells a lie, have you noticed nobody can challenge it? Because if somebody stands up and says that's a lie, they get thrown out. And there's actually a democratic issue for us, I think, in that people can walk into Parliament and say things, and it's very difficult to challenge them without getting into trouble. I think it's just a curious way in which our system has got to work. Well, again, I'm trying to be careful what I say. I knew there was a website called borisjohnsonlies.com, and I looked at it, and my blood pressure rose, as it usually does. But what I wanted to share with you from that was, he actually has an introductory bit which talks about why lying matters. And I thought it was quite interesting. The guy who set this website up, who says he's a journalist, I don't know who it is, but he says these things. I'll read out what's on the screen, because I thought this was an interesting explanation, and I think it chimes in with where we've been already from the Sermon on the Mount. Why lying matters. Many believe that it is in the nature of politicians to dissimulate and lie. They say, should have done this slightly larger. I'll turn around and read it off the screen. They say it is as futile to complain about this as to complain that wasps sting. But many politicians possess integrity. If you shrug your shoulders and say they're all liars, then you are giving a free pass to all liars and cheats. Minor deceit displays an attitude that truth simply does not matter. Remember, political lying has consequences. Governments which get away with lies get away with this government the lies protect. They never take responsibility for error and failure. Billions of pounds are siphoned by cronies or simply wasted. People lose trust in their governments and ignore them even when they are telling the truth. They therefore persist in behaviours which are harmful to them, their families, their community, their country and their planet. For these reasons, all lies by government are significant, even those which seem trivial. Together they build a fog which blots out the boundary between truth and falsehood and hides the faces of those who do dark deeds in the state. I thought that was quite an interesting argument about why truth matters and why lying matters. You can come and tell me if you disagree with me afterwards, but I felt that was something to note. And I think there is a challenge in our society. There's a challenge in our society about how significantly people take the importance of telling the truth. And as people in the church, and as people who are followers of Jesus, we have a responsibility. You know, the whole argument about salt and light, it only takes a little bit to dispel. We need to be people who are keen, willing to tell the truth, and are known for telling the truth, people who keep our word. Because the other thing that happens is in a personal level, and it can rot relationships. I thought I ought to be honest here because I'm talking about telling the truth. And part of the honesty is Susan and I celebrate having been married for 50 years in a few days' time. And if you were to ask Susan what it is that has most annoyed her about spending 50 years of her life with me, she would probably tell you, and she'll tell me after whether I was right or not, that I still haven't learned that saying I'll be ready in 5 minutes' time and then being ready in 15 minutes' time is really annoying. And somehow I have managed to work out that 5 minutes for me is 15 minutes for everybody else. And it's a joke. I know it does irritate her and I try to avoid it, but it's part of my nature and I need prayer and ministry afterwards to get that issue solved. I can make a joke about that. Susan finds it less funny than I do. But you know that somebody who consistently doesn't keep their word to you, it rots the relationship, doesn't it? If somebody lets you down, I'll do this, I'll be there at 3 o'clock and at 4 o'clock they're not there, It's very frustrating. And what happens is, the next time they say, I'll see you at 3 o'clock, you're not sure they will be, and maybe you don't bother. Does this make... So there's a sense in which being honest to one another, telling the truth, and keeping our word to one another is a vital part of relationships. It's a vital part in church. We're conscious as a leadership team, if we say we're going to do something, we need to keep our word. Or if there's a reason why we can't, we need to explain that. We need to be open and honest on these kind of things. And some of you will be thinking about the people you know, the situations, people at work who've let you down. How many people have been promised by a boss, yes, of course you'll get that new post, of course you'll get that pay rise, of course, and then it never happens. And what's the result? You start thinking, I'll go and work somewhere else because I don't trust what I'm being told by the managers. That's happened to lots of people. It happens in personal relationships. It happens in families. It's really sad, isn't it, when family relationships break down. You hear of children who haven't spoken to their parents for years because they were let down. There was something rotted the relationship. People didn't keep their word. You promised that and you never delivered it. Jesus is getting right down to the heart of how relationships function. They function on the basis that we trust one another. And part of the reality of being a Christian is that part of our confidence in following Jesus is that we trust what he has said to us. We trust what God has said to us. We know that God does not lie. It would be very difficult to be a follower of Jesus if we thought that one day God said this and another day God said something different. Or God had promised to save us from our sins, but maybe that's not true. God had promised he wants to spend eternity with us in heaven, but maybe he'll change his mind. Do you see how it would just be completely subversive of our faith? So here's the challenge from these verses, from the Sermon on the Mount. How good are we at keeping our word? How good are we at telling the truth? How good are we at making truth the basis of our relationships with one another? If you're in a home group, we'd start having a long discussion about when it's okay to tell a lie. We can all think of situations, I don't know about you. If you've ever been to the sing-along Sound of Music, it's great fun. But about the noisiest part of it is when the German troops are going through the cemetery looking for them, and there's a lot of people shouting, "They're behind the tombstone!" People want to tell the truth. Well, I think you'd think if somebody had done that at the time, it wouldn't have been a good time to tell the truth. You're taking it very seriously, obviously very concerned about the subversion of the sound of music here. So. But the starting point for all of us should be, we are people who keep our word. One of the things that makes us perhaps a little bit cautious about is what exactly we promise. I need to be careful what I promise to Susan if I know I might have to change my mind about it. We all need to be careful about it. If we make the promise, we need to be people who keep our word. And when we do that, relationships can flourish. Our relationship with God can flourish. Our relationships with society can flourish. It's one of the bedrocks of a functioning society is that you trust people. I used to do a history lesson when I was a history teacher. Funny that, isn't it, do history lessons when you're a history teacher? It was the only lesson I ever did when a boy leaving the classroom, a 15-year-old, he said to me, "I didn't believe a word you said this morning, sir." And all I'd done was taken a £5 note out of my wallet and tear it in two and say, "You see, money is only paper. It only works on the basis somebody believes that when you hand it over in a shop, you'll get £5 worth of goods for it." And I'd been teaching about hyperinflation in Germany. And I had an illustration of that from my own experience. When I was working with Tiff, and I visited someone from Tiff who was working in Argentina. And she said, "Oh, I just need to pop into the shop and get something." She came back and she said, "I just bought some chewing gum." She said, "I paid for that chewing gum what I paid for my flat 10 years ago." We have an inflation crisis at the moment. I think we'll have a bigger one if we're paying for houses what we paid for paying for chewing gum what we paid for houses. But it was the whole point about belief and trust. And you remember, banknotes used to say, "I promise to pay the bearer." There was a promise on the piece of paper which was supposed to be kept. And the whole of our financial system is based on that kind of trust. And if that trust gets broken, then we have a problem. Actually, one of the problems is it leads to inflation because people want more to... I'll get off the economics fairly rapidly. So that was the lesson. One boy was very concerned and wanted to know if I'd really wasted a £5 note doing that. And I was able to explain to him, if you sellotape it up, you can still use it. That used to be true. You can't tear them in half now. So, I'm glad I'm not a history teacher anymore. But I was very touched at his concern for my financial well-being. But this other boy didn't believe it. The belief that the piece of paper was actually worth something was so strong. God can be trusted. He keeps his promises, so should we. Sermon on the Mount is Jesus explaining to the people he was talking to, the significance of how the law operates in reality and what kind of people we should be, how we should live in God's world, God's way. And when it comes to what we say, it's not about how strong the oath is that we take, it's whether we're people, when we say yes or no, our word can be trusted. And for some of us, that may be more of a challenge than others. Some of you may now be thinking of promises you made to God that you've struggled with over the years. Some of you may be thinking about promises you made to other people that you weren't able to keep or didn't keep. These things that Jesus taught are realities that affect our lives day by day. So the Lord help us to be people of our word, people who are trustworthy, and then people will be able to trust us and we'll be representing God and Jesus in our society.